Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the night is long, the rain is steady, and the darkest stories unfold in whispers. Tonight, we go back in time, not to the highways of California, but to the dusty streets of Austin, Texas, in the 1880s. A city just beginning to grow, filled with wooden houses, oil lamps, and whispers of progress. But behind the glow of lantern light, something else stirred, something no one could explain. Women began to die. Servant girls, attacked in their homes as they slept. The killer moved silently through the night, carrying an axe, leaving behind chaos and blood. Families awoke to screams, neighbors huddled in fear, and soon the entire city realized a predator was among them. The newspapers gave him a name, the Servant Girl Annihilator. A figure so brutal, so relentless, that some would later wonder if he crossed the ocean and became Jack the Ripper himself. So let the rain fall, let the world outside fade away, as we tell the haunting story of America's first true serial killer, the Servant Girl Annihilator. In the late 19th century, Austin, Texas, was a city caught between two worlds. On the surface, it was a place of progress, a community eager to prove itself as a modern urban center in the American South. The population was just beginning to swell, commerce was growing, and the city's leaders imagined Austin as a beacon of civilization in a rugged land. But in the shadows of its lamplit streets and wooden houses, something darker was stirring. This was not yet the Austin of live music, technology, and politics. In the 1880s, it was still a frontier town in many ways, filled with transient workers, African-American laborers who had only recently emerged from the grip of slavery, and white families trying to shape a new life after the chaos of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was into this unsettled mix of ambition, poverty, and vulnerability that a predator first emerged. The earliest murders attributed to the killer, later called the Servant Girl Annihilator, seemed at first like isolated tragedies. Servants in Austin, often young black women employed in domestic work, lived on the margins of society. They worked long hours for little pay, usually living in small, separate quarters behind the houses of the families they served. In the summer of 1884, when the Texas heat pressed down on the city, the first of these women was found dead. She had been attacked in her sleep, her body left battered, her life snuffed out with sudden, terrifying violence. The brutality of the act was shocking even for a community accustomed to frontier hardships. Yet at first, many treated it as a horrific anomaly, an isolated crime in a city still learning to police itself. But soon, another killing followed, and then another. The attacks bore grim similarities. The victims were servant women, attacked at night while sleeping or resting in their modest quarters. They were struck with blunt force, sometimes cut with a blade, sometimes assaulted in ways that spoke of a sadistic fury. The killer left behind scenes of chaos and blood, bodies brutalized with a ferocity that suggested more than simple murder. It suggested rage, or perhaps a compulsion that went beyond reason. In the neighborhoods of Austin, word began to spread quickly. Families who had once allowed their servants to live in small wooden shacks behind their homes now grew fearful. Some brought their servants into the main house at night, locking doors and windows tightly. Others left the city entirely, terrified of what seemed to be a predator lurking in the darkness. The African-American community, already marginalized and vulnerable, bore the brunt of the fear. To them, the killings were not random accidents. They felt the shadow of something more deliberate, more sinister. Women began refusing certain jobs, unwilling to risk isolation in houses where the killer might strike next. The newspapers, hungry for stories, seized on the murders. They printed lurid accounts, describing the gruesome scenes with words designed to shock and captivate readers. Austin had never seen anything like this before. Violence was not unusual in the American South of the 1880s, Disputes often ended in shootings or brawls, but this was different. This was not the chaos of a drunken fight or the cruelty of domestic abuse. This was systematic. It was targeted. And it was repeated. The city's press began to whisper about a midnight assassin, a shadowy figure who moved with ease through neighborhoods, vanishing into the night after leaving death in his wake. By early 1885, the pattern was undeniable. The attacks were no longer confined to one part of the city. Servant girls in different neighborhoods, sometimes separated by blocks or even miles, were being targeted. Witnesses reported seeing shadowy figures slipping between houses or hearing strange sounds in the night, only to awaken to screams and find another woman had been butchered. Each time the killer struck, the violence seemed to escalate. He did not simply kill, he mutilated, he brutalized. He seemed to revel in the act. It was as if each crime fed his hunger, driving him to seek more. The fear in Austin grew palpable. Imagine the streets in those years, dimly lit by gas lamps, the glow barely piercing the night. Narrow dirt roads lined with wooden fences and modest houses, their windows shuttered tight. Families huddled together in the dark, ears straining for any sound out of place. Dogs barked more often, doors were bolted earlier, and men began patrolling their neighborhoods with guns and lanterns. Yet none of it seemed to matter. The killer always slipped through, choosing his victims with terrifying precision. One of the most unsettling aspects of the early murders was the lack of a clear motive. The victims were poor, often with little in the way of money or possessions. Robbery was not the goal. Nor were the killings simple acts of vengeance, as no one could find clear personal connections between the victims and any would-be enemies. Instead, the violence seemed almost impersonal, random in its selection, but deeply personal in its brutality. The police, ill-equipped and inexperienced, scrambled to respond. This was a time before modern forensics, before fingerprinting, before psychological profiling. Investigators relied on witness accounts, footprints in the dirt, or vague suspicions. And in Austin, a city still growing into its role as a capital, the police force was small and overwhelmed. They arrested suspects, sometimes based on flimsy evidence, but they never held them for long. The killings continued. By the spring of 1885, 7 women had been attacked. 5 were killed, 2 survived, though badly injured and traumatized. Survivors described the killer as a shadowy figure, often glimpsed only in the faint light of a lantern or moon. One survivor claimed the man was tall, another thought he was white, others insisted he could have been black or mixed race. The confusion only added to the terror. He seemed almost inhuman in his ability to strike without being caught, to disappear into the night as if the city itself conspired to hide him. The attacks were not limited to African American women for long. While the first victims were servant girls, women whose lives and deaths barely registered in the consciousness of Austin as wealthier classes, the killer's scope widened. His brutality did not discriminate forever. He began targeting women of higher social status, white women from prominent families, dragging them from their homes or attacking them in their beds. This escalation shattered the illusion that only the marginalized were at risk. Now, everyone felt vulnerable. Fear spread across racial and class lines, uniting the city in dread. The city's elite, once dismissive of the murders as tragic but distant, suddenly demanded action. They pressured the police, organized night watches, and began openly criticizing the authorities for their failure to protect the community. But still, the killer evaded capture. Each new killing only deepened the panic. Some families fled the city altogether, abandoning homes and businesses in search of safety elsewhere. The brutality of the attacks drew comparisons that would echo years later. When Jack the Ripper began his reign of terror in London in 1888, newspapers in America immediately connected the two. Could it be the same man? Had the Servant Girl Annihilator, uncaught in Texas, crossed the ocean to stalk the streets of Whitechapel? The theories would persist for decades, fueled by the similarities. Women targeted at night, sudden attacks with blades and blunt force. A seemingly unstoppable predator who struck with fury and then vanished. But in Austin in the mid-1880s, no one had such a name for him yet. To them, he was simply the midnight assassin, the shadow at the edge of the lamplight, the reason they no longer felt safe in their own homes. He was the figure who haunted their sleep, whose presence turned the still Texas nights into hours of dread. For the servant girls who worked tirelessly each day, his name was spoken in hushed tones, as if even saying it too loudly might invite him to their door. And in the summer of 1885, his violence would only grow worse. What began with the marginalized and voiceless would soon tear through the very heart of Austin society, leaving the city shaken in ways it would never forget. By the summer of 1885, Austin was no longer the ambitious little capital that had dreamed of progress and prosperity. It had become a city gripped by fear, its quiet streets transformed into pathways of dread, its people living under a shadow that seemed to grow longer with each passing night. The Servant Girl Annihilator, though not yet named in those exact words, had already established himself as an unseen presence, a predator who stalked the edges of lamplight and knew how to disappear into darkness as if he belonged to it. What began as whispers after the first killings had, by now, become a constant drumbeat of unease that touched every household. From the poorest servant quarters to the grandest homes of Austin's wealthiest citizens, the effect of the murders on daily life cannot be overstated. For a city of less than 20,000 people, each new killing felt like a direct blow to the community's heart. People no longer felt safe stepping outside after dark. The once familiar ritual of walking home from church socials or visiting neighbors became acts of quiet defiance against an unseen enemy. Entire families retreated behind bolted doors, extinguishing their lamps earlier than ever, hoping that darkness itself might conceal them from the assassin who seemed to roam so freely. Women in particular lived with a sense of constant vulnerability. They were the chosen victims, whether black servant girls or, increasingly, white women from more privileged households. For them, the night became an enemy, the quiet of their own homes a fragile barrier against intrusion. Even sleep no longer offered rest, for the killer often struck when his victims were lying helpless in bed. Beds, once symbols of comfort and safety, now became reminders of the peril that awaited them if the shadow chose their door necks. The press, of course, amplified these fears. Newspapers in the 1880s were not restrained in their reporting. They wrote in sensational terms, describing every brutal detail with language that was lurid, even voyeuristic. Headlines warned of a human fiend who stalked the streets, of a demon in human form who carved a path of blood through the capital of Texas. Each new issue seemed to bring another horrific story, another victim, another escalation. The details: a crushed skull, a woman dragged from her home, a body mutilated, were described in prose that both horrified and fascinated readers. The citizens of Austin read each account with a morbid fascination, but the effect was not cathartic. Instead, it deepened the sense of helplessness. If even the press could not explain who this killer was, or how he moved so easily from home to home, what hope did ordinary people have of protecting themselves? Churches, too, became part of the response to the terror. Ministers preached sermons about sin and punishment, some declaring that Austin was under divine judgment. The killings, they said, were evidence that the city had turned its back on God, and the predator was his scourge upon them. These sermons offered little comfort, but they did reinforce the idea that the murders were not just crimes, but something greater, something more sinister than one man with an axe. Some even began to speculate that the killer was no ordinary man at all, but a demon, a supernatural figure who could vanish into shadows and appear where least expected. In an age before scientific investigation, when folklore still held power, such theories took root easily in the minds of frightened citizens. The police were overwhelmed, and their very visible struggle to respond to the murders only heightened public anxiety. Austin's police force in the 1880s was small and ill-equipped, designed to handle petty crime, drunken brawls, and the occasional theft, not a calculating killer who struck again and again, leaving little evidence behind. Officers patrolled the streets with lanterns and pistols, but the killer seemed always to elude them. They questioned suspects, made arrests, even held men in jail for days at a time, but nothing ever stuck. Each time they thought they had caught the culprit, another killing would occur, proving them wrong. The city's residents began to lose faith in the ability of law enforcement to protect them, and with that loss of faith came a gnawing sense of isolation. It was as if each family stood alone against the darkness, left to their own devices to survive the night. This loss of faith had its own consequences. Vigilante groups began to form, men banding together with rifles and lanterns to patrol their neighborhoods. Some of these groups were organized by local communities, others by political leaders eager to show they were doing something. But these patrols often accomplished little more than spreading further fear. The sight of armed men roaming the streets by torchlight was itself unsettling, a reminder that the city had become a battlefield. Its citizens conscripted into a war they never wanted to fight. Rumors spread like wildfire that the killer was a black man with superhuman strength, that he was a white man hiding in plain sight, that he was an outsider who had drifted into Austin with evil intent. Each rumor carried with it the weight of prejudice and suspicion, and in a city already divided by race and class, the murders deepened existing tensions. Innocent men were arrested, interrogated, and sometimes beaten, their lives disrupted simply because someone pointed a finger in their direction. The African American community felt this pressure most acutely. Because many of the first victims were black servant women, suspicion often fell unfairly on black men. Dozens were questioned, and some were even charged, though never with enough evidence to convict. This added to the community's fear. Not only were they the most likely targets of the killer, but they were also the most likely to be blamed for his crimes. The result was a deep and painful sense of being trapped, hunted by one man in the night, hounded by suspicion in the day. Meanwhile, the murders themselves grew bolder. The killer seemed to thrive on the very fear he created, as if the city's terror was part of his design. He dragged women from their beds, sometimes while others slept nearby. He assaulted them in yards, in alleys, even in open spaces where discovery was a real possibility. The audacity of his attacks suggested a man who felt invincible, who knew that the police were always one step behind. Each murder was a taunt, each escape a reminder that he moved freely in a city that was becoming a prison for everyone else. The psychological toll of this constant fear was profound. People began to see threats in every shadow, to hear footsteps in every rustle of leaves. Neighbors distrusted each other, wondering if the killer was someone they already knew, a familiar face glimpsed in daylight who transformed into a predator after dark. Suspicion poisoned the bonds of community. Families who had once left their doors unlocked now barred them with planks of wood. Mothers told their children not to linger outside after sunset, and women began sleeping in groups, believing that safety could be found in numbers. Even then, the murders continued. By late 1885, Austin was a city under siege, not by an army or by an invading force, but by one man or perhaps more than one who struck with inhuman cruelty and left the city guessing when he would appear again. Some citizens wrote letters to the newspapers demanding action. Others begged for more patrols. Still others threatened to leave the city if something wasn't done. And yet, no solution appeared. The killings continued into 1886, and with each one, the fear in the city deepened, becoming almost a living thing that breathed alongside the people. This climate of terror set the stage for the killer's escalation. If his early victims were marginalized and forgotten by the city's elite, his later crimes would cut through the very heart of Austin's social structure, proving that no one was safe. The fear that had once been whispered in servant quarters would soon echo through the halls of the city's most prominent families, cementing the Servant Girl Annihilator not only as a murderer but as a specter who haunted an entire community. By the winter of 1885, Austin had transformed from a hopeful young capital into a city that seemed perpetually shrouded in unease. The attacks had become more than a series of isolated tragedies. They had developed into a grim pattern, one that law enforcement, the press, and the citizens themselves could not ignore. What set the Servant Girl Annihilator apart from the ordinary violence of the frontier was not only the brutality of his crimes, but the terrifying regularity with which he committed them. It was as though the killer worked to a rhythm only he understood, a cadence of blood that echoed through the city's nights. Each murder revealed certain consistencies, and these consistencies began to form the shape of a monster in the minds of Austin's residents. The victims, at least at first, were predominantly women, often young, often African American, often employed in the households of the city's white citizens. These women were vulnerable by circumstance. Living in detached servant quarters or small outbuildings behind homes, they were separated from the relative safety of their employers' families. Their isolation made them easy prey. The killer seemed to know this, as if he watched from the shadows, waiting until he was certain of his target's solitude. The manner of the attacks carried the same cruel signatures. Victims were bludgeoned with a heavy object, often an axe, a tool that was commonplace in Austin at the time. Every household had one for chopping wood. Every yard held one leaned against a wall or left embedded in a log. In a frontier city, it was an ordinary object. But in the hands of the killer, the axe became something else, a weapon of horror, the symbol of his ability to twist the tools of everyday life into instruments of murder. After the initial blow, victims were often dragged outside, their bodies left in yards or alleys, stripped of dignity in death, as they had been in life. Some were mutilated, assaulted in ways so brutal that even the newspapers, which relished sensational detail, struggled to put the reality into words. The attacks typically occurred on weekends, most often on Saturday nights or early Sunday mornings. This pattern quickly caught the attention of the press and the people. Sundays in Austin became days of both worship and dread, when families would awaken to church bells mingling with the news that another life had been taken. The regularity of the killings suggested planning, perhaps even ritual. To many it felt as if the killer moved according to a schedule, marking time not by the calendar of the city, but by his own cycle of compulsion and release. The killer also showed a striking boldness in his movements. He was not deterred by the presence of others. On more than one occasion, victims were attacked while other people slept in nearby rooms. Whole households awoke to screams, only to find that the predator had struck and vanished before anyone could stop him. This suggested a chilling confidence, or perhaps a terrifying recklessness. He did not fear discovery. He did not fear pursuit. He seemed to know that by the time anyone awoke, he would already be gone. The randomness of the attacks added another layer of horror. Though the victims fit certain broad categories, there was no personal motive that investigators could determine. The killer was not driven by robbery, as money and valuables were often left untouched. He was not eliminating rivals or settling grudges. His violence seemed detached from reason, committed for its own sake, as if the act itself was the goal. To a city that prided itself on progress and order, this randomness was particularly terrifying. People could not predict who would be next, nor could they identify any way to protect themselves other than to wait and hope that the killer's gaze fell elsewhere. As the pattern emerged, the people of Austin began to study it obsessively. Rumors circulated about footprints left in the dirt, about strange figures spotted near homes, about doors found open in the morning that had been locked the night before. Citizens tried to piece together clues, creating their own theories about the killer's identity. Some believed he was a madman, driven by impulses beyond his control. Others suspected a calculated predator who moved with cunning and precision. The contrast between these theories only deepened the fear. Was Austin plagued by a lunatic who might strike anyone at any time, or was it haunted by a mastermind who chose his victims carefully, stalking them for days before making his move? The newspapers, in their relentless coverage, began to feed the idea that the killer was more than just a man. They called him the Midnight Assassin, a phrase that quickly spread among the people. This gave the killer an almost mythical quality. He was no longer just flesh and blood, but a phantom, a figure who belonged to the night itself. Mothers told their children not to wander after dark because the assassin might be waiting. Men spoke in taverns about hunting him down, but when the lanterns were extinguished and the streets grew quiet, even the bravest felt a chill when they stepped outside alone. The escalation of violence added another dimension to the pattern. Each new murder seemed more brutal than the last, as if the killer was refining his methods, feeding a hunger that grew insatiable. Survivors, though few, spoke of sudden, overwhelming force, of being struck before they even knew what was happening. The swiftness of his attacks suggested a strength and decisiveness that made resistance nearly impossible. Those who lived to tell the tale were left traumatized, their accounts fragmented by fear, but they all agreed on one thing: the killer was merciless. By early 1886, the pattern was unmistakable. The city counted at least 8 confirmed murders, with others suspected but not proven. The killings spread across neighborhoods, touching every corner of Austin, from the poorest shacks to the respectable homes of the city's middle class. The randomness of the attacks shattered any illusions of safety. No one could say with certainty that their family was safe, no matter how strong their locks or how vigilant their watch. The pattern was not simply one of violence. It was one of terror as a tool wielded with precision to paralyze an entire city. Even the authorities began to admit that they were dealing with something unprecedented. The police could not explain the killer's ability to vanish, nor could they predict his next move. Their efforts to patrol the streets and arrest suspects became almost farcical in the face of the assassin's continued success. Every failure only reinforced the sense that Austin was in the grip of something beyond human control. Some even began to whisper that the city was cursed, that the killings were a punishment for sins, or a dark omen of worse things to come. What made the pattern even more chilling was the sense that the killer fed on the fear he created. Each new murder was followed by a surge of panic, a flood of speculation, a frenzy of rumor. And then, as the city began to calm, as people dared to hope the nightmare had ended, he struck again, rekindling the terror. It was as if he understood the rhythm of the city's emotions and timed his attacks to maximize their effect. Whether by design or instinct, the result was the same. Austin was caught in a cycle of dread that seemed impossible to break. The murders also revealed a disturbing social reality. At first, the city's leaders treated the deaths of black servant women as tragedies, but not as urgent matters for action. Only when white women from prominent families began to fall victim did the panic reach every level of society. This disparity did not go unnoticed. For the African American community, The pattern of violence carried not only the weight of personal loss, but also the bitter reminder of their place in a society that valued some lives more than others. The Servant Girl Annihilator exploited these divisions, his crimes cutting across racial and class lines in ways that forced the city to confront its deepest prejudices. By the time the murders reached their height, Austin was a city transformed. Fear dictated daily routines. The pattern of violence was now a pattern of life, woven into the fabric of existence in the capital of Texas. It shaped conversations, dictated behavior, and cast a shadow over every quiet street and dimly lit yard. The citizens lived with the knowledge that the assassin could strike anywhere, at any time, and that no one, not the poorest servant nor the wealthiest matron, was safe from his reach. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the killer began to escalate in a way that would shake Austin to its core. The pattern was no longer limited to the marginalized. The predator was ready to leave behind servant quarters and turn his attention to women whose names and families carried weight in Austin society. What had once been a terror whispered in backyards and alleys was about to explode into the forefront of the city's consciousness, in murders so bold and so public that they would forever cement the legend of the Servant Girl Annihilator. By the spring of 1886, Austin had reached a breaking point. For nearly 2 years, the city had endured the midnight terror of a killer who struck without warning and vanished without trace. The working poor had suffered most, with servant girls and laboring women bearing the brunt of his savagery. But now the Annihilator, as the newspapers had begun to label him, was no longer content to haunt the margins of society. His violence escalated with chilling precision, moving from the vulnerable servant quarters to the bedrooms of the city's most respected citizens. It was a shift that shocked Austin to its core, transforming whispers of fear into outright hysteria. The transition began quietly enough, though in hindsight it was a clear signal of what was to come. Earlier attacks had revealed a killer who was bold, but not reckless, someone who moved under cover of night, striking women who were isolated, alone and unprotected. But by early 1886, he began to show signs of ambition. Survivors described him as more brazen, less careful, as if he had grown impatient with the limits of his earlier crimes. It was not enough to terrorize servant women. He seemed to crave recognition, to prove that no one in Austin was beyond his reach. The first of these escalated attacks came in May, when 2 women of white, middle-class standing were brutally assaulted in their own homes. They were not servant girls hidden away in wooden shacks, but respectable women living within the walls of Austin's established neighborhoods. The attacks bore the same trademarks: sudden nighttime entry, bludgeoning blows with an axe, and assaults that shocked even hardened investigators. The escalation was undeniable. For the first time, women with status and influence had become the targets, and with that shift, the killings took on a new dimension of terror. Austin's social hierarchy had always been sharply defined. The early victims, black servant women, were mourned, yes, but largely in silence, with little outrage from the city's elite. Their deaths were seen as tragic but peripheral, part of a violent undercurrent that respectable society could choose to ignore. But when white women were attacked in their own homes, the city's leaders could no longer look away. Suddenly, the assassin's crimes were not just horrors whispered in the alleys of East Austin, but crises that demanded action from every level of government and law enforcement. The fear spread like wildfire. Newspapers devoted entire front pages to the murders, filling column after column with grisly details and breathless speculation. Ministers preached sermons warning that the city had fallen under the grip of Satan himself. Families who once dismissed the killings as distant now bolted their doors, boarded their windows, and huddled together at night with pistols and shotguns within reach. The very idea that the assassin could move so easily between neighborhoods, passing from the quarters of the poor to the parlors of the wealthy, shattered any illusion of safety. The escalation culminated in a pair of murders that remain among the most infamous in Austin's history. On Christmas Eve of 1885, the killer claimed to prominent victims Susan Hancock, a white woman in her 40s, and Eula Phillips, a young woman barely out of her teens. Their murders, committed on the same night, cemented the Annihilator's reputation as a figure of unprecedented brutality. Susan Hancock lived in a respectable neighborhood with her husband and children. That night, as the family slept, the killer entered their home. Susan was attacked with an axe, her body dragged into the yard, and mutilated in a manner so grotesque that even the most hardened reporters hesitated to describe it. Her husband, sleeping inside, claimed to have heard nothing until it was too late. The audacity of the attack, breaking into a family home, striking a woman upstanding, and leaving her body displayed as if to taunt the community, sent shockwaves through Austin. But the killer was not finished. That same night, only blocks away, he entered the home of Jeans and Eula Phillips. Eula was just 17, married young to an older man. She was attacked with the same ruthless force, bludgeoned and dragged into the yard. Her body bore signs of savage assault, a spectacle of violence that stunned the city. Unlike previous murders, this was not confined to the shadows. It was as if the killer wanted the city to know he could strike wherever and whenever he chose, even in the heart of Austin's most respectable families, even on the holiest of nights. The double murders marked a turning point. What had begun as a series of killings on the margins had become a direct assault on the very structure of Austin's society. Fear turned to outrage. Citizens demanded answers. Rumors ran wild that the killer was a butcher, a doctor, a madman, even a foreigner who had slipped into the city under false pretenses. Some whispered that he was invisible, a phantom who could pass through walls and vanish into the night. Others insisted he was someone well-known, a man who blended in by day and transformed into a monster after dark. The police, already under scrutiny, faced relentless pressure. They arrested several men in the wake of the Christmas Eve murders, including James Phillips himself, who was accused of killing his wife in a fit of jealousy. Though the evidence against him was thin, the idea that a husband might have committed such a crime fit neatly into the prejudices of the time. Phillips was tried, but the jury ultimately acquitted him. Still, the damage was done. The police appeared desperate, chasing false leads while the real killer remained at large. Each failure only deepened the city's despair. The escalation also drew national attention. Newspapers from New York to Chicago carried stories about the Austin murders, labeling them as among the most gruesome in the nation's history. Some journalists speculated openly about the possibility that the killer might strike beyond Texas, that his reign of terror could spread across the country. When Jack the Ripper began his spree in London just 3 years later, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Even then, some wondered if the Servant Girl Annihilator had crossed the ocean to continue his work on foreign soil. What distinguished the Annihilator's escalation from other killers was not just the brutality of his crimes, but the calculated way he dismantled the city's sense of order. By targeting servant girls, he preyed on the vulnerable. By moving on to respectable white women, he shattered the illusion of social protection. And by killing 2 women in one night, on Christmas Eve, he made clear that no barrier, not class, not religion, not even the sanctity of family, could protect Austin from his wrath. His violence was not random chaos. It was a deliberate campaign of terror, one that left the city paralyzed. The escalation also exposed the fragility of Austin's identity. The city had prided itself on being modern, civilized, a beacon of progress in Texas. But the Annihilator revealed the truth. Austin was still a frontier town at heart, with limited law enforcement, fragile social structures, and deep divisions of race and class. The killer exploited all of these weaknesses, using the city's vulnerabilities as his camouflage. Each murder was not only an attack on a woman, but on the very idea of Austin as a safe and orderly place. For the families of the victims, the escalation was devastating. Husbands, children, and parents were left to grapple with the unimaginable horror of losing loved ones in such brutal fashion. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that the killer remained free, that justice seemed out of reach. Funerals became public events attended by hundreds, each one a grim reminder of the city's helplessness. The sight of coffins carried through the streets, accompanied by weeping relatives and grim-faced neighbors, became part of Austin's collective memory, a ritual of mourning that seemed to repeat itself with each passing month. And yet, even as the violence escalated, the killer's identity remained elusive. Despite the arrests, the trials, the speculation, no one could prove who the Annihilator truly was. He moved like smoke, appearing where least expected, and vanishing before anyone could lay hands on him. His escalation only deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. How could a man commit such crimes in a city of 20,000 without being caught? How could he enter homes, drag women into yards, and mutilate them without leaving behind clues that pointed unmistakably to him? The questions haunted Austin as much as the murders themselves. By the end of 1886, the city had endured nearly 2 years of terror. The escalation had turned the Servant Girl Annihilator from a local menace into a national figure of infamy. His murders had crossed boundaries of race and class, leaving no family untouched by fear. The pattern of violence had become a pattern of life, and the people of Austin could only wonder what new horrors awaited them when the sun went down. The escalation of the Annihilator's crimes was not only the climax of his reign, but also the beginning of its end. For with greater boldness came greater risk. The very audacity that made him a legend would also set the stage for mistakes, suspicions, and theories that lingered long after the killings stopped. And though the murders would eventually cease, the terror he unleashed would never truly fade. The escalation of murders in late 1885 and 1886 forced Austin into a frenzy of desperate searching. The citizens demanded answers. The newspapers fanned the panic with their lurid coverage. The police, undermanned and underprepared, scrambled to appear competent. And in this chaos, suspicion fell on a wide array of individuals, some guilty of nothing more than being outsiders, some burdened by their race, and some unfortunate enough to be related to the victims themselves. The investigation into the Servant Girl Annihilator remains, even today, a study in how fear, prejudice, and desperation can obscure the truth. The police force of Austin in the mid-1880s was small and poorly resourced. For a city with aspiration of modernity, its law enforcement remained firmly stuck in the past. The officers were men of limited training, more accustomed to chasing down drunks or breaking up brawls than to investigating a serial murderer who killed with precision and audacity. The department lacked forensic tools, fingerprinting was not yet in practice, blood evidence was useless, and psychological profiling was unheard of. Their methods relied on eyewitnesses, on rumors, and on confessions coaxed from frightened or coerced suspects. It was hardly surprising that the killer, whoever he was, stayed one step ahead of them. Yet the police did not sit idle. After the first few murders, they increased their patrols, particularly in neighborhoods where servant quarters dotted the backyards of wealthier homes. They questioned anyone seen lurking at night. They arrested drifters, vagrants, and men of suspicious character. They tried to impose a sense of order by showing that they were doing something, anything to combat the terror. But with each new body found, the city's faith in its protectors collapsed a little more. The earliest suspects were almost always black men. This reflected not only the racial prejudice of the era but also the fact that many of the first victims were black servant women. Police reasoned, with little evidence, that the killer must come from the same community. Dozens were interrogated, a handful were jailed for weeks, and some were publicly accused in the newspapers. But each time, the murders continued, proving that the authorities had the wrong man. These false arrests deepened the fear within Austin's African-American community. They were doubly victimized, hunted at night by a killer, and hounded by day by law enforcement. In one particularly tragic case, a man was arrested after being found wandering near the site of an attack. He had no connection to the victim, no evidence tied him to the crime, but his presence in the wrong place at the wrong time was enough to seal his fate in the public eye. Though eventually released, his reputation was destroyed. Stories like his were repeated again and again, as innocent men found themselves cast into suspicion simply because the city was desperate to find anyone to blame. But as the killings escalated, particularly after the murders of Susan Hancock and young Eula Phillips, suspicion broadened. It was no longer enough to target only the poor and marginalized. The brazenness of the Christmas Eve murders forced the authorities to look closer to home, to consider that the killer might be hiding in plain sight within Austin's respectable classes. For the first time, white men of standing were accused. The case of James Phillips, Eula's husband, became one of the most infamous episodes in the investigation. Phillips was a troubled man, known for his drinking and volatile temper. When his 17-year-old wife was murdered, suspicion naturally turned to him. The police theorized that he had killed her in a jealous rage, perhaps after a domestic quarrel. He was arrested, charged, and put on trial. The newspapers had a field day, portraying him as a brute and a drunk, the perfect villain for a city desperate for closure. Yet the evidence against him was circumstantial at best. There were no witnesses, no direct proof, only whispers and speculation. Nevertheless, he stood trial for his wife's murder, facing the possibility of execution. In the end, the jury acquitted him, perhaps unconvinced by the lack of evidence or unwilling to believe that one man could be responsible for the entire string of murders. But the trial left a stain on his name and did nothing to stop the killings. Another suspect emerged in the form of Moses Hancock, the husband of Susan Hancock, the other woman murdered on Christmas Eve. Moses, too, was accused of killing his wife, despite his protests of innocence. He was a respected man, a figure of some prominence in Austin, but the desperation of the authorities made him a target. He was eventually cleared, but the damage was done. His grief was compounded by the humiliation of being branded a murderer, a cruel twist of fate for a man who had lost his wife in such brutal circumstances. Beyond husbands, suspicion also fell on strangers. Austin in the teen 80s was a city in flux, with laborers, drifters, and immigrants passing through in search of work. Each time a new man arrived in town, particularly if he was foreign-born, rumors swirled that he might be the killer. Germans, Mexicans, and even itinerant workers from the northern states were eyed with suspicion. The newspapers speculated wildly, suggesting that the killer might be a mad doctor, a butcher with a taste for blood, or even a traveling lunatic who struck wherever he went. These theories often said more about the prejudices of the time than about the reality of the crimes. One of the more enduring theories suggested that the killer was a man with medical knowledge. The mutilations inflicted on some victims appeared to be deliberate, as if someone with anatomical training had committed them. This led to speculation that a local doctor might be responsible, or that a butcher, accustomed to carving flesh, was behind the killings. Yet no evidence ever confirmed this idea. It lingered because it was easier to imagine the killer as a man of peculiar skill rather than to accept the possibility that he was simply an ordinary man with extraordinary cruelty. As the months dragged on, the investigation grew increasingly chaotic. Vigilante groups took matters into their own hands, patrolling the streets at night with shotguns and lanterns. Some citizens swore they had seen shadowy figures slipping through alleys, only to find nothing when they pursued them. Others reported strange noises, suspicious strangers, or unexplained footprints. Each rumor fueled another, creating a web of paranoia that made it nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. The police, desperate to show progress, arrested more suspects. At one point, they claimed to have caught the killer, parading him before the press as the solution to the city's nightmare. But when another murder followed soon after, their credibility collapsed. It became clear that no one truly knew who the assassin was, or how he managed to strike again and again without capture. In the years that followed, historians and crime writers would revisit the suspects, speculating about who the Annihilator might have been. Some named Nathan Elgin, a young African-American man who lived in Austin, and was later convicted of another violent crime. Elgin was arrested in 1886 after assaulting a woman and was eventually executed for murder. His violent tendencies and presence in Austin during the killings made him a plausible suspect. But whether he was the Servant Girl Annihilator has never been proven. Others suggested that the killer might have left Austin after the escalation, moving on to other cities or even to London, where Jack the Ripper began his spree just 3 years later. The similarities between the crimes, women attacked at night, mutilated with savage precision, fueled endless speculation that the two killers might be one and the same. For the people of Austin, however, these theories offered little comfort. In 1886, what they knew was that their city was being torn apart by fear. Every man was a suspect, every shadow a potential threat. The police, exhausted and humiliated, seemed no closer to solving the mystery than they had been after the first murder 2 years earlier. And so the terror continued, leaving Austin trapped in a nightmare from which it could not awaken. The investigation into the Servant Girl Annihilator stands today as one of the earliest examples of a city grappling with the reality of a serial killer. It revealed the limitations of 19th-century policing, the corrosive power of rumor, and the deep divisions of race and class in a southern city still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War. Most of all, it revealed how fear can paralyze a community, turning neighbor against neighbor and leaving justice forever out of reach. By the summer of 1886, the killings would suddenly stop. But the damage was done. The investigation had produced suspects' trials and endless speculation, but no answers. The identity of the Servant Girl Annihilator remained hidden in shadow. And in that shadow, Austin's citizens found no peace, only the haunting knowledge that the man who had terrorized their city might still walk among them, unseen, unpunished, and undefeated. By the height of the summer of 1886, Austin had become a city suspended in dread. For nearly 2 years, its citizens had endured the calculated savagery of a killer who seemed to strike with impunity. The Servant Girl Annihilator, the name whispered in streets and printed in newspapers, had already taken at least 8 lives, perhaps more. His victims had spanned the spectrum of society, from black servant women to white women of prominent families, and each new attack had seemed more brazen, more brutal, and more taunting than the last. Yet, just as suddenly as his crimes escalated, the murders would come to a halt. It was an ending without resolution, a silence that left more questions than answers. The period leading up to this sudden cessation was marked by the most infamous of the murders, the twin killings of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips on Christmas Eve of 1885. Those murders had set the city aflame with fear, outrage, and speculation. The brutality of the crimes, the social prominence of the victims, and the religious significance of the night combined to elevate the killings into legend almost as soon as they occurred. But in the months that followed, while fear remained, the pattern began to shift. Some historians argue that the killer may have grown reckless after Christmas Eve. The audacity of attacking two women in one night, and in such public and shocking ways, may have increased the risk of discovery. Witnesses claim to have heard noises, to have seen figures in the darkness, to have glimpsed shadows moving across yards. For the first time, there was a sense that the killer might have been seen, however fleetingly. Such exposure could have forced him to reconsider his methods, or even to abandon his campaign altogether. But others believe that the murders did not end abruptly. In early 1886, there were still incidents that bore the hallmarks of the Annihilator. Women were attacked in their homes, assaulted and beaten, though not always killed. In some cases, the victims survived, their lives spared, though their bodies bore terrible injuries. These survivors described a man who moved with frightening swiftness, who struck with overwhelming force, and who vanished into the night before help could arrive. Yet the very fact that they survived may have signaled a change in the killer's behavior. Either he was losing his control, or his compulsions were shifting in ways the city could not comprehend. One of the final murders attributed to the Annihilator occurred in the spring of 1886. The victim was again a young woman, attacked in the familiar pattern, struck with an axe, dragged from her home, and mutilated. The newspapers seized on the details, but by this time the city had almost grown numb. The horror was no less acute, but it had become expected, almost routine. Each Sunday morning seemed to bring fresh tragedy. Another headline, another funeral. For the citizens of Austin, the killings had become woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant backdrop to every conversation and every precaution. And then, without warning, the murders stopped. After the summer of 1886, there were no more bodies found in yards, no more servant girls dragged from their quarters, no more mutilated women discovered at dawn. The silence was as sudden as the violence had been relentless. At first, no one believed it. Families still locked their doors, still huddled together at night, still glanced nervously into the shadows. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, it became clear the Servant Girl Annihilator had vanished. The abrupt end of the killings gave rise to endless speculation. Some believed that the killer had been arrested for another crime, his identity hidden in the records of Austin's jails. Others thought he had fled the city, moving on to new hunting grounds elsewhere. Still others whispered that he had died, perhaps in an accident, or the hands of an avenging relative. Theories flourished, but none could be proven. The silence itself became part of the mystery, an absence that was as haunting as the presence of the crimes. Among the theories, one of the most enduring is the suggestion that the Annihilator left Austin and resurfaced in London as Jack the Ripper. The timing, the methods, and the sheer brutality of both killers invited comparison. Jack the Ripper began his spree in Whitechapel in 1888, just 2 years after the Annihilator's reign ended. Both targeted women, both struck at night, both mutilated their victims with an almost theatrical cruelty. Could they have been the same man, moving from the small frontier capital of Texas to the teeming streets of London? Some crime historians entertain the possibility, though others dismiss it as coincidence. The connection remains tantalizing but unproven. Another theory centers on a man named Nathan Elgin, a young African-American laborer who lived in Austin during the murders. In 1886, Elgin was arrested after a violent attack on a woman. He was eventually executed for that crime. His age, his presence in the city, and his known capacity for violence make him a plausible suspect. Some researchers argue that his arrest and execution may explain the sudden end of the Annihilator murders. Yet there is no definitive evidence linking him to the earlier killings, and the truth remains uncertain. Still others point to the possibility that the killer was someone within Austin's respectable classes, a man whose name was known but whose secrets remained hidden. The trials of James Phillips and Moses Hancock had already demonstrated how quickly suspicion could fall on husbands and fathers. Perhaps the real killer was one of them, or someone like them, a man whose public face concealed a darker reality. The sudden silence of the murders could then be explained by relocation, by death, or even by a conscious decision to stop. If the Annihilator was indeed a man of standing, his identity may have been protected, intentionally or otherwise, by a society eager to bury its shame. The effect of the sudden end was profound. For the citizens of Austin, the silence was both a relief and a torment. On the one hand, the killings had ceased. Families could once again sleep without the constant expectation of screams in the night. Women could walk the streets cautiously, but with less fear. The city began to recover, slowly, from the paralysis of terror. On the other hand, the lack of resolution meant that there was no closure. No trial, no confession, no execution. The Annihilator remained a phantom, his identity hidden, his crimes unanswered. The silence felt unfinished, like a story without an ending. This lack of closure ensured that the legend of the Servant Girl Annihilator would endure. The name itself became a kind of shorthand for terror, a reminder of the time when Austin had lived in fear of the night. Parents told their children stories of the assassin, warning them to be wary of strangers, to lock their doors, to respect the darkness. The murders became part of the city's folklore, repeated in whispers long after the actual events had faded into history. But for the families of the victims, the silence was no comfort. They had lost daughters, wives, mothers, and sisters. Their grief was raw, their anger unresolved. The absence of justice meant that their loved ones' deaths remained open wounds unhealed by time. Funerals had been held, graves filled, prayers spoken. Yet the knowledge that the killer had never been caught lingered like a shadow over every memory. For them, the silence was not relief, it was abandonment. In the end, the sudden silence of 1886 transformed the Servant Girl Annihilator from a criminal into a legend. His crimes, horrific in their own right, became magnified by the mystery of their ending. A killer who had terrorized a city, whose violence had escalated to the point of madness, had simply disappeared. It was as if he had dissolved into the darkness that had always seemed to protect him. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying aspect of all. For if the killer could vanish so completely, then he could just as easily return. The people of Austin could never truly rest easy. Each unexplained scream in the night, each shadow that flickered across a lamplit street, each rumor of a stranger lurking nearby, all of it carried the echo of the Annihilator. His reign may have ended, but his presence lingered, etched into the collective memory of the city. The silence was not an ending. It was a pause, a void filled with dread, a reminder that some monsters are never truly gone. When the murders of 1886 suddenly stopped, Austin did not breathe a sigh of relief so much as it fell into a stunned silence. The violence that had consumed the city for nearly 2 years had become part of its rhythm. Every Sunday morning had been shadowed by the possibility of new headlines, fresh funerals, another grieving family. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the nightmare ended. Yet endings without answers are rarely peaceful. The sudden absence of killings left a vacuum that was quickly filled by speculation, theories, and legends. In the absence of justice, the people of Austin sought meaning, and in that search, the Servant Girl Annihilator passed from the realm of fact into the realm of myth. One of the most persistent theories centered on a young man named Nathan Elgin. Elgin was 21 years old, African American, and a known troublemaker in the city. In early 1886, he was arrested for assaulting a woman, and in the course of his capture, he killed another. His violent tendencies were undeniable. He was eventually tried, convicted, and executed for his crimes. To some in Austin, the timing was too perfect to ignore. Elgin's arrest and execution coincided with the abrupt end of the Annihilator murders. Was he the killer all along? If so, his capture explained everything: the silence, the sudden absence of terror. Yet there was never definitive evidence linking Elgin to the earlier crimes. He fit the profile in some ways: young, violent, local, but the truth was murkier. Perhaps he had been a violent man, but not the monster who had stalked Austin's nights. Or perhaps he had been both. Another enduring theory was far more dramatic: that the Servant Girl Annihilator had crossed the ocean and reappeared in London as Jack the Ripper. The parallels were seductive. Both killers targeted women, both struck at night, both mutilated their victims with savage precision. Jack the Ripper's spree in Whitechapel began in 1888, just 2 years after the Austin murders ceased. Some historians, as well as sensationalist newspapers of the era, suggested that the Annihilator had left Texas for England, transforming himself into the most infamous serial killer in history. While no hard evidence supports this theory, the allure of connecting to unsolved mysteries has ensured its survival. It speaks to the human need to create continuity, to impose order and chaos, even if the connection is tenuous at best. Still, other theories placed the killer closer to home. Some argued that he was a man of prominence in Austin, someone whose public standing shielded him from suspicion. This theory gained traction in part because of the trials of men like James Phillips and Moses Hancock, who were accused of killing their wives but acquitted. If husbands could be so quickly blamed, might the real killer have been someone hiding in plain sight, someone respected and unsuspected? In a city of only 20,000, it seemed impossible that the Annihilator could have gone unnoticed. Yet perhaps his very ordinariness was his camouflage. Perhaps he attended church, greeted neighbors politely, and by day seemed no different from any other citizen. The horror lay in the possibility that the killer had been sitting in pews on Sundays, listening to sermons about the murders he himself had committed hours before. Beyond individuals, there were broader explanations. Some claimed the killer was a transient, a man who passed through Austin, left his mark, and then moved on to another city. The frontier of the 1880s was full of drifters, laborers, and men whose names were never recorded in history. Could the Annihilator have been one of them, vanishing as suddenly as he appeared, leaving Austin scarred and searching for answers? Others suggested he might have died in an accident, in a fight, or from disease. Life was precarious in 19th century Texas, and men often disappeared without explanation. If the Annihilator had died, his secret would have died with him. What is most striking about these theories is not whether they are true, but what they reveal about the city itself. Each theory reflects the anxieties, prejudices, and hopes of the people of Austin. Blaming Nathan Elgin reflected racial biases and the desire for closure. Connecting the case to Jack the Ripper reflected the fascination with transatlantic crime and the hunger for sensationalism. Suggesting a man of prominence reflected an ease with the city's own elite, the suspicion that respectability could mask corruption and cruelty. Each theory was less about the killer himself than about what the community feared and what it wanted to believe. As the years passed, the murders faded into legend. The Servant Girl Annihilator became less a historical figure and more a symbol, a ghostly reminder of the fragility of safety and the unpredictability of violence. Parents told their children stories of the killer as warnings, much as others told tales of witches or monsters. The newspapers occasionally revived the story, especially when new crimes stirred echoes of the past. But the Annihilator himself remained an enigma, a shadow on Austin's history that could never be fully erased. The legacy of the murders was profound. On a practical level, They exposed the weaknesses of 19th century policing. The Austin police had been overwhelmed, their methods outdated, their resources inadequate. The failure to catch the killers shook public confidence in law enforcement, a wound that lingered long after the murders ceased. On a social level, the killings revealed the stark racial and class divisions in the city. The deaths of black servant women were mourned quietly, while the deaths of white women caused public hysteria. The Annihilator exploited these divisions, and in doing so forced Austin to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives were valued and whose were not. The cultural legacy extended far beyond Austin. The idea of a faceless killer who struck in the night, leaving no trace, entered the American imagination. The Servant Girl Annihilator predated Jack the Ripper by several years, yet he is often forgotten outside of Texas, overshadowed by the London killer's global fame. But in many ways the Annihilator was the prototype, one of the first serial killers to be documented in the United States, one of the first to inspire widespread panic, one of the first to demonstrate how a single man could terrorize an entire city. For historians, the case remains endlessly fascinating. It sits at the intersection of history and mystery, a puzzle with pieces missing, a story with no ending. Every few years, a new book or article revisits the murders, proposing new suspects, new theories, new explanations. Yet none have been definitive. The Annihilator remains, and likely will remain, unidentified. That very lack of resolution is what keeps the story alive. If his name had been known, if he had been caught and hanged, his story would have ended in the 1880s. Instead, it continues to echo, haunting not only Austin but the field of true crime itself. In the city of Austin, his legacy is visible even today. The neighborhoods where he struck have changed, the wooden servant quarters long since vanished, replaced by modern homes and businesses. But the memory remains, woven into the fabric of the city's history. Walking those streets at night, one can almost imagine the fear that gripped them more than a century ago, the flicker of lantern light, the hurried footsteps, the whispered prayers. The Annihilator is no longer a physical threat, but he is still a presence, a ghost who lingers in the collective memory. Perhaps that is his true legacy, not the murders themselves, as horrific as they were, but the lasting sense of vulnerability they created. Austin learned, in those 2 years, that safety is an illusion, that violence can erupt anywhere, that monsters are not confined to the margins, but can strike at the heart of a community. That knowledge did not vanish when the killings stopped. It became part of the city's identity, a shadow that cannot be erased. The Servant Girl Annihilator remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American crime. His identity may never be known, his motives never understood, his fate never uncovered. But in some ways, that uncertainty is what makes him unforgettable. He is less a man now than a legend, a symbol of the darkness that lies just beyond the reach of the lamplight, a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we never truly see. The silence that followed the murders of 1886 did not erase the memory of the Servant Girl Annihilator. If anything, the absence of answers made the crimes more enduring. In Austin, the story lingered in hushed recollections, in fragments of newsprint yellowing in attics, in the oral traditions of families who had lived through the terror. With each retelling, the Annihilator became less a man and more a specter, a shadow that belonged to the city itself. Yet his story would not remain contained within Austin's borders. In time, it would travel, transformed by comparison, and tangled with the legend of another far more infamous killer, Jack the Ripper. Together, the two figures would come to symbolize not only the brutality of 19th century crime, but also the cultural fascination with the unknowable darkness that lies within man. In the decades immediately following the murders, Austin moved on, at least outwardly. The city grew, developed, and reshaped itself into the state capital it aspired to be. The servant quarters where many of the victims had once lived were demolished, replaced by newer homes and businesses. The ex-murders slipped from the headlines as other concerns, politics, economics, wars, and progress, filled the pages of Texas newspapers. But memory has a way of clinging in places where blood has been spilled. For those who lived through the terror, the nights of 1884 to 1886 could never be forgotten. Children who were kept indoors after sunset, families who huddled with weapons at their sides, women who feared to sleep alone, all carried the scars of those years. Even when the killings ended, they left behind a wound that never quite healed. Stories persisted in Austin's communities, told in whispers or passed down around dinner tables. Parents used the tale as a cautionary warning for their children. Lock the doors, stay close, beware the darkness. In African American households, the murders took on an added layer of pain, for the first victims had been women of their community, women whose lives had been undervalued and whose deaths had not sparked the same outrage as those of the city's white elite. The memory of the Annihilator thus carried with it not only fear but also bitterness, a reminder of the inequities that had shaped both the crimes and their aftermath. The comparison to Jack the Ripper began almost immediately after the London murders erupted in 1888. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic drew parallels, eager to link to unsolved mysteries and to speculate about the possibility of a single man behind them both. The similarities were undeniable in broad strokes. Both killers attacked women at night, both mutilated their victims, both eluded capture despite intense investigations. Both created a climate of fear that gripped their cities and made headlines far beyond their borders. It was a natural, if speculative, connection to make. Theories sprang up suggesting that the Servant Girl Annihilator, frustrated or endangered in Austin, had fled to London, where he resumed his campaign of violence under a new name. Writers pointed to the timing: the Annihilator's last murders in 1886, the Ripper's first in 1888. They noted the escalation of brutality in Austin, culminating in mutilations that seemed eerily similar to those in Whitechapel. If the Annihilator had been a transient, they argued, if he had boarded a ship and crossed the ocean, then perhaps he had found in London's teeming East End the perfect hunting ground to continue his work. The idea was thrilling, terrifying, and ultimately unprovable. No evidence has ever been found to link the two killers. Their methods, while superficially similar, also diverged in key ways. The Annihilator often used an axe or blunt instruments, whereas the Ripper relied on knives. The Annihilator attacked women in homes and yards, dragging them into the open, while the Ripper prowled the streets, targeting prostitutes in the shadows of alleys. Yet the comparisons endured in part because both cases remained unsolved. The mystery itself created space for speculation, for stories that blended fact and fear into something larger than truth. The cultural memory of the Servant Girl Annihilator in Austin was shaped as much by this comparison as by the crimes themselves. To be linked, however tenuously, to the most infamous serial killer in history gave Austin's story a grim notoriety. It ensured that the murders would not be forgotten entirely, even as the city modernized and generations passed. Local historians revisited the case periodically, sometimes to debunk the Ripper theory, sometimes to argue for new suspects, sometimes simply to remind Austinites of the darkness that once walked their streets. By the 20th century, the Servant Girl Annihilator had become part of Austin's folklore. He was remembered less as a man than as a legend, a bogeyman invoked in stories to frighten children or to evoke the city's haunted past. Ghost tours in the city still speak of him, recounting the nights when women were dragged from their beds and murdered under the cover of darkness. Writers and true crime enthusiasts rediscovered the case, seeing in it a precursor to the age of modern serial killers. The Annihilator became a kind of prototype, the American shadow that foreshadowed the Ripper's infamy. Cultural memory is not only about what happened, but about how stories are told. The Annihilator's victims were real women: Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Clara Strand, Sue Hancock, Eula Phillips, and others whose names deserve to be remembered. But over time, their identities were blurred, their stories overshadowed by the legend of the killer himself. This is often the cruel fate of true crime. The victims fade into the background, while the murder becomes immortalized. In Austin, however, efforts have been made in recent years to recover those names, to acknowledge that the legacy of the Annihilator is not only a story of terror but also one of mourning for lives cut short. The comparison to Jack the Ripper highlights another uncomfortable truth: fame and crime is not distributed equally. Jack the Ripper became a global icon of horror, studied in countless books, films, and academic works. The Servant Girl Annihilator, by contrast, remained a local legend, known in Austin, but largely forgotten elsewhere. Some argue that this is because the Ripper's crimes were more sensational, his letters to the police more theatrical, his timing in London, the world's largest city at the time, more ripe for international coverage. Others suggest that the racial and class dynamics of Austin's murders played a role, that the early victims, being black servant women, did not command the same attention from the national press as the white prostitutes of Whitechapel. In this sense, the Annihilator's relative obscurity may be as much a reflection of prejudice as of the crimes themselves. Yet within Austin, the Annihilator's place in cultural memory is secure. His story is retold not only as a piece of macabre history but also as a lens through which to view the city's past. It is a reminder of how vulnerable a community can be, how limited its institutions once were, how fear can spread like wildfire. It is also a reminder of resilience, for despite the terror the city endured, the streets once stained with blood are now busy thoroughfares, the servant quarters are gone, but the memory remains. Comparisons to Jack the Ripper ensure that the Servant Girl Annihilator will always occupy a strange liminal space in history, both overshadowed and illuminated. Overshadowed because the Ripper's legend is so vast that it eclipses almost every other serial killer of the 19th century. Illuminated because the very act of comparison keeps Austin's story alive, ensuring that the Annihilator is not forgotten. He may not have achieved the global infamy of the Ripper, but he remains an essential part of the narrative of how societies understand and remember violence. Today, more than a century later, the Servant Girl Annihilator is remembered not only in history books but also in cultural works. Novels, plays, and local lore continue to reference him. True crime writers revisit the case, probing for new insights. Historians examine the murders to understand the social dynamics of 19th century Austin, the racial tensions, the role of women, the limitations of law enforcement. The Annihilator has thus become more than a killer. He has become a prism through which to view the past, a figure who embodies the fears and failings of his time. In the end, cultural memory is less about facts than about resonance. The Servant Girl Annihilator resonates because his story remains incomplete, unresolved. He was never caught, never named, never punished. That absence haunts the imagination. He exists in the gaps of history, in the silence after the screams, in the unanswered questions that still hang over Austin. And in that way he remains alive, not as a man, but as a legend, a ghost woven into the identity of a city and compared forever to the shadow that stalked London's streets. When the murders ceased in 1886, Austin tried to exhale, but the relief was shallow, tentative, and uneasy. For 2 years the city had been forced into a waking nightmare, its quiet streets turned into hunting grounds, its homes breached by an unseen predator who moved like smoke between lamplight and shadow. The killer was never named, never tried, never executed. His identity vanished into silence, leaving only scars on the city he had terrorized. And in that silence lay the true horror, not knowing, never knowing, what manner of man had walked among them, and why he had stopped. The Servant Girl Annihilator entered legend not because of what was revealed, but because of what was left unsaid. For the families of the victims, there was no closure. They buried their daughters and wives, they wept in crowded funerals, they spoke in hushed voices at night. But the unanswered question, who had done this, haunted them long after the mourning bands had been removed. Mothers looked at strangers in the marketplace and wondered if the man before them was the one who had killed their child. Husbands looked at co-workers and questioned if they were sitting beside the murderer of their wives. Every unknown face became suspicious, every friendly greeting concealing a hidden possibility. Without a name, grief could never settle. It remained raw, reopened with every rumor, every whispered theory, every headline that dredged the murders back into memory. The city itself carried the wounds. Austin in the mid-1880s had been poised between its frontier past and its ambitions for modernity. It wanted to be a capital worthy of attention, a growing symbol of Texas's promise. Instead, it became known for the Annihilator, for nights of horror, for a police force overwhelmed, and a community paralyzed. Newspapers across the country reported on the killings, transforming Austin from a hopeful young city into the stage for America's first documented serial killer. That was a legacy the city could not shed, no matter how much progress came after. The murders stained its history in a way that no new building, no economic success could erase. The epilogue of the Annihilator as story is not about him alone, but about what his presence revealed. He exposed the fragility of institutions, the vulnerability of women whose lives were already undervalued, the deep racial divides that distorted justice when black servant women were slaughtered. Their deaths did not provoke the same outrage as the murders of white women months later. Their families grieved in silence, their communities mourned in fear, while the larger city treated them as lesser tragedies until violence touched its elite. That disparity is part of the Annihilator's legacy too, a reminder that murder is not only an act of violence, but also a mirror reflecting what a society chooses to see and what it chooses to ignore. The legend that grew after the killings was fed by absence. An unsolved case becomes fertile ground for speculation, and in Austin, theories multiplied like vines. Some pointed to local men with tempers and secrets, others to outsiders and drifters. Some insisted Nathan Elgin was the killer, executed before he could strike again. Others whispered that he had fled the city and resurfaced as Jack the Ripper, carrying his horrors across the ocean. None of these theories were ever proven, but their persistence shows the hunger for explanation. People cannot live easily with the void of unanswered violence. They fill it with guesses, with connections, with stories. And over time, the stories matter more than the truth. By the 20th century, the Servant Girl Annihilator had become a shadow in Austin's cultural memory. His name was not always spoken, his deeds sometimes half forgotten, but he lingered in ghost stories, in warnings, in the unspoken knowledge that once long ago, this city had been stalked by something unspeakable. The very strangeness of his name, Servant Girl Annihilator, coined by a journalist with a taste for the dramatic, kept the memory alive. It sounded almost theatrical, grotesque, a phrase that hovered between crime and myth. And that is where the Annihilator remains, not quite history, not quite legend, but a liminal figure suspended between them. The true final act of the Annihilator as story is not in his disappearance, but in what followed. Austin grew. Its streets were paved, its neighborhoods expanded, its reputation reshaped. But underneath the progress was the faint echo of those years when fear governed the night. The Annihilator became Austin's ghost, the figure that haunted even when forgotten, the reminder that violence can come suddenly, inexplicably, and leave no resolution behind. for a city that prided itself on growth and order, that wound never fully healed. In many ways, the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator is not about him, but about us, about how communities respond to terror, about how memory functions when justice fails, about how legends are born from absence. We see in him the first outlines of what the 20th century would come to know too well: the serial killer, the predator without reason, the figure who terrorizes not only individuals, but entire societies. The Annihilator was a precursor, a grim foreshadowing of horrors to come. And yet, because he was never caught, he remains an outlier, a ghost with no face, no body, no name. The victims, too, deserve the last word. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Clara Strand, Sue Hancock, Eula Phillips, and the others whose names history has sometimes obscured. They were daughters and wives, workers and dreamers, women who lived in a city that did not protect them. Their lives were cut short, their identities too often overshadowed by the shadow of the man who killed them. To remember the Annihilator without remembering them is to miss the true weight of his crimes. The epilogue, then, must be theirs: a mourning for lives lost, a recognition of the human cost hidden behind headlines and legends. And so the story ends as it began, in darkness. A city asleep, a figure moving silently through the night, an axe gleaming in lamplight, a screen swallowed by shadows. The murders stopped, but the darkness never left. It lingers in Austin's history, in the memory of families, in the whispers of ghost tours, in the speculation of historians. The Servant Girl Annihilator remains what he always was: a shadow, a mystery, a wound without healing. The final silence after his last killing was not peace, it was uncertainty, which is a deeper terror than violence itself. To be killed is horror, but to live never knowing why, never knowing who, never knowing if the danger has truly passed, that is the torment the Annihilator left behind. His legacy is not only the bodies and graves, but the minds he haunted, the community he scarred, the truth he stole when he vanished. As the lamps of 19th century Austin gave way to electric light, as the wooden servant quarters were replaced by brick homes and businesses, as the city expanded into the modern capital it would become, the Annihilator faded into the background of memory. But memory is never erased. It flickers when the night is too quiet, when a shadow passes too swiftly, when a story is told to remind us that evil once walked here. And perhaps that is the truest ending, that we do not forget, that we cannot forget, that the Servant Girl Annihilator, though nameless, faceless, and forever hidden, still waits at the edge of Austin's history, a reminder that the darkest nightmares are not always confined to dreams.